All right, it looks like Leander is ready to go. And I don't
Can
want to
everyone
hold
hear
him
me
up.
okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, cool.
If everyone can preserve bandwidth by shutting off their video and please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question or otherwise conversing with Leander.
Okay. Sorry, I was going to put the slides full screen here, but that blanks out both of my screens with LibreOffice here. But thanks for coming today, guys. Hopefully this is useful. We have a guest today. That's my friend from university, John Breyer. We were roommates, 15 years ago. So he's an old Red Hat employee and stuff. So if you want to yell at somebody about System D, he's your guy. So I just put him on the spot there. Anyway, but this is I'm just going to do a quick kind of presentation. This is based off the one I did at Southeast Linux Fest in 2022. It was I modified it a little bit and added some slides just for context because I'm not sure what everyone's familiarity with some of the technical photography and video editing stuff is here, but so it's a little bit different, but it's kind of based on the same thing. But photography and media production in a Linux world, how do we accomplish that? First of all, a little bit about me. I started photography in the early to mid 2000s. I'm a longtime Linux user, longtime Mac user as well. A compulsive camera collector. It's getting to be a problem, kind of, not really, but and I ran Adobe and Apple for photo and video work until about 2013. That's about the time that Adobe kicked in with Creative Cloud, and I felt Apple's hardware was getting a bit not for me anymore. So I started switching to Darktable and and Linux. I started using Darktable actually on Apple first. But there are several other software packages we'll talk about with respect to actually doing this stuff on Linux. This is a sample of some of my work here. First question, are you crazy? And I would say that in a way, this is kind of returning to normal. If you remember the 90s, this is an SGI workstation here. A lot of creative work was done on Linux and Unixy operating systems, 3D modeling and stuff like that. It's only been recently, probably in the last 15 years, where we've equated creativity and doing these things with Apple and Adobe and stuff like that. So I would argue this is more of a return to normal in some ways. Red Hat actually supports a number of software packages in this domain too. Pixar Renderman used to run on Red Hat workstations back in the day. They make the movies Maya, and there's a couple other 3D rendering packages. So it's not really an alien concept to be doing creative artsy kind of work on Linux and Unixy systems. To that extent, there are tons of software packages out there to do this sort of stuff. These are just a sample of them. Darktable, Hugen is a panorama generator. You've got everybody knows the GIMP, the GNU image manipulation program or project. I forget which it's called. Raw Therapy, Olive video editor. Blender is probably the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's been used in movies and whatnot, and they have the Blender Foundation, which funds the project's development, and it's kind of cutting edge in a lot of ways. Krita is a drawing photography program. You can edit photos in it, but it's mostly drawing, and Kdenlive is the KDE's project video editor. It's actually the one I use a lot, although I've been messing with Olive lately. So there are lots of tools available. Why would you want to do this? Adobe sucks and is monopolistic. Adobe has kind of gotten away with everything Microsoft dreamed of in the 90s. This is a screenshot from a Mastodon instance where it turns out that if you're using Creative Cloud and their syncing feature, Adobe is collecting its the work of its customers to train their AI models. That's problematic from, one, it's from a consent standpoint. That's problematic because it's opt-in. You usually don't know what's happening. And they just start doing it without asking your permission. Then you have to go and opt out of it. The other side of that is data leaks, training set data leaks. And there are artists who maybe do work that is personal, private. Maybe you are working for someone under an NDA, it doesn't have to be anything crazy. And, an Adobe engineer leaks your stuff, or a hack happens, because if their machine learning algorithm can see the images to train itself, that means that it's unencrypted on their end, and so can their engineers, so can anyone who happens to stumble into Adobe's back end. Another thing is avoiding digital serfdom. If there's a philosophy I've had in my use of technology, is I pick the option that gives me the most independence. And I believe that craftspeople should have the ability to have complete control of their tools. And this Adobe situation is a prime example of, the tool doing things behind your back. The tools are finally mostly there. We have, I would say, most of what you need to do digital photography and at least basic video editing on Linux. So, with open source tools, and most of these tools, all those programs in that previous slide, are available, I believe, on Windows and Mac as well. So even if you don't run Linux, you can play along at home and learn these tools in a comfortable environment, if you wish. There's no vendor lock-in pressure. Adobe, getting out of the Adobe ecosystem, getting out of the Capture One ecosystem, is hard to do. With FLOSS software, that's not an issue. You're in more control of your data. These tools tend to be developed faster. GIMP is the GIMP is kind of a outlier there. They move slow, but Darktable, Raw Therapy, Kdenlive, Blender, they move very fast, and they have more state-of-the-art color science and imaging science, which I'll talk about a little bit, than I feel some of the proprietary tools. And coming down to that, they have more sophisticated tools. There's a lot of tools that are focused more towards the beginner and the intermediate part of the thing, part of the market. And a lot of these tools I feel are more geared towards people with more expertise, maybe want the ability to kind of control their image processing and video processing more fine grained in a fine grained manner, and have more control over what's going on. If you're using Lightroom and Photoshop, it kind of makes some choices for you in the background, and you end up with having to deal with those. With Darktable and Raw Therapy and stuff, you don't have that issue. You can, anything the tool lets you to do, you can do. So with that in mind, here's kind of the state of doing photography on the Linux desktop in 2023. Things we have: file storage and management. I feel like this is something we have better than Windows and Mac people, because with Linux you can use advanced file systems like Btrfs or ZFS and have better data integrity than you can with like checksumming and stuff, and snapshots and backups are a little bit easier on Linux. We have advanced organization features. If you there's actually, I forgot to put it on the slide, but there's a software package called Digicam. It's another KDE tool that has facial recognition, open source facial recognition. Both Darktable and Digicam have map and geolocating. So if you have a GPS in your camera, you can do, you can organize your photos by location. So that's there. Color managed displays in X11. So there's a process called calibrating, where you can calibrate your monitor so that that the green or the blue that you're seeing on the screen is pretty accurate. We have that in X11. We have raw development, and I'll go over that, what a raw file is. But basically, you can take a camera raw file and make a JPEG out of it. Printing, and this is on both of them, kind of. And I say that because we have printer support, but only for particular models. Getting paper profiles is a little bit trickier on Linux. I can print from Linux with my Canon wide format, but I mostly do it from an old Mac, just because some of the paper profiles and stuff are a little funky still. So it kind of works if you stick within a certain set of boundaries. Things we do not have. Colored managed displays in Wayland. This is being worked on by Red Hat and Valve. Valve, the gaming company, is actually coming up there with Red Hat in terms of savior of the Linux desktop. Um, easy integrated mobile and cloud syncing. This isn't a big deal for me, but I hear this a lot out of the younger generation. To them, photography and video media production and consumption is mobile. It happens on their phone. They create on their phone. They share on their phone. And some of these proprietary packages offer is the easy ability to sync between your laptop, desktop, and your mobile device and do things on social media. We don't really have that because open source software is generally a diaspora of people who work on projects and they don't always have great interoperability with each other. It depends on your point of view. That can be a positive and negative. I think for the generation coming up, that's going to be seen as a negative and probably should be approached by these projects. Printing, again, kind of. We have it with some caveats. HDR display support. This is something I don't even think Windows has down great yet. And this is another thing that Valve and Red Hat are working on. As much as we like to pick on Red Hat and corporate Linux, they do finance a lot of what makes the Linux desktop work. So that's coming. We're getting higher bit depth panels and stuff like that. And so that's going to be important in the future. And the integrated creative suite, that kind of goes with the easy integrated mobile and cloud syncing. The real strong point of the Adobe Creative Suite is that all the tools work together. You can, take a photo from Lightroom, put it into Photoshop with one click, do your editing, move back to Lightroom. You can take things from Photoshop, move them into Premiere. Video is really more JB's thing. He knows more about that, but and edit it and back and forth. We don't really have that. They're separate tools made by separate groups of people, and so it's a little bit trickier to move things in between. So it's kind of an easy use thing. So this is where I'm getting into stuff that I'm not sure what your guys' background is, since it's not really a photography group. So I kind of talk about some fundamental groundwork stuff when it comes to photography here. So I'm sorry, you can take a nap if you know this or bored or whatever. What is a RAW? A photo, it's not a photo exactly, but a data container. It is the unmanipulated data from the sensor. Most of us, when we use the camera, we get a JPEG file, the Joint Photographic Experts Group file. If you use a professional camera, and some high-end smartphones now will actually produce this, you can get what's called a RAW file. And each camera has its own RAW format and its own container and everything. But it is the full, whole shebang that the sensor can capture, the whole dynamic range, the whole color, everything. It's probably analogous to the negative in the analog world. If you shot film, this is probably closer to a negative than a print, whereas a JPEG, I would say, would be closer to a print. It gives the best access to the dynamic range and the color data gathered by the sensor. We have different sensor patterns here: Fuji X-Trans, the traditional Bayer pattern, and those are the way that all sensors are monochrome, and then they have a filter over top of them to make them capture color, and that's what these patterns are. Depending on that, can influence how things are, how the sensor sees things and stuff like that. So the more data you have, the better. It's if you're an audio person, the difference between RAW and JPEG is like the difference between a CD or a FLAC file and and like a very heavily encoded MP3 file is a JPEG. So you want the RAW if you really want to mess with it. You're talking, so a JPEG, just to give you an idea, has 8 bits of lighting data of dynamic range in it. So 256 bits of 256 levels of brightness differentiation. I have cameras that will do 14 bits of RAW and stills, which is much more range that it can detect as far as light levels from the absolute dark to the absolute light. It's called dynamic range. And dynamic what now, if you don't know that term? This is the measurement of the total values a sensor can measure before a photo site overloads. That's called clipping or overexposure. It's usually measured in an exposure value, EV. I call this the third dimension of the sensor. If you look at camera websites and camera manufacturers, they're always talking megapixels, which is, megapixels. If you have a 12 megapixel sensor, that's usually a 4 by 3000 ish pixel sensor. So, a width and a height. So if you're thinking a cube, dynamic range is how deep the sensor is. That's how much light it can hold before it overloads. Um, and that's what these are histograms here on the right. So the top one is a normal exposure. The middle is overexposed, and the bottom is underexposed. And what that means is think about this. This right hand side here is full brightness. So everything on this right side here would be pure white. Everything on this left side here would be pure black. And so here on the overexposed side, you would see you've lost a lot of data. Your histogram kind of peak is off the scale here. That means all this data is white. It's gone. Um, Same thing with underexposed. Say, this is analogous to leaving the lens cap on kind of thing. You didn't leave the exposure going long enough, or your ISO wasn't high enough, or your aperture was stopped down too much, and you didn't get enough data to the sensor. And so this is all down here in the shadows and literally black. The sensor didn't get enough information. So the more advanced your sensor is, and it's deeper its bucket to capture dynamic range, this gives you more room to wiggle in here. And this is a technology that's always increasing. Here I have a graph that I stole from DxOMark, comparing the Nikon D700, which is a camera from about 15 years ago now. Oh Lord, sorry about that. Let's go. Ah, dang it. Okay. From about 15 years ago now. And you can see that at its base ISO of 200, which is the sensitivity of the sensor, it's got about 12 stops of range. Whereas you look at the D850, which is same camera kind of range, it's just a few generations newer, about 10 years newer, that's increased to 14 stops. So you have an HDR and basically a single frame on this camera. So there's a lot of meaty data there in order to help you create better images and not have this problem of it clipping and losing data. So you really want full access to that. Before we talk about that more, let's talk about how raw development works. I've been active in the free and open source photography community for a number of years now, and we always get people showing up to the forums. They're sick of, they're starting out. Maybe they don't want to pay Adobe's licensing fees or DxO's licensing fees or Affinity Photos and anymore. And they're used to those software packages, and they show up and they open Darktable or they open Raw Therapy and they try to convert their raw files. And they're like, this doesn't look like what I get out of raw Lightroom. And we're like, yes, it's because, these are just buckets of bits. Raw processors just do math on buckets of bits to convert them to something your display can show. Each one of them, has their own math, has their own algorithms for doing things. We don't really know what Lightroom is doing because it's closed sourced, so we kind of have to make best guesses. But Darktable and Raw Therapy, we can look at the source code and see what kind of math it's doing to the image to create your output here. But because they all use different approaches, they do not all produce the same results. It's like giving a chef, even if you give a chef the exact same ingredients and you say, make me a cake, you're going to get a different cake out of it. That's the same sort of thing here. These are different chefs, and maybe they're different riffs on the same thing. That doesn't mean like one chef's cake is necessarily better or canon or canonical. It just means that they're different interpretations, different restaurants, different styles of food. It's the same thing here. So we get people coming in because Adobe, I guess, marketing, I don't know. Anyway, marketing is as the de facto standard, and they get a little upset because, I did this in Darktable and the color looks a little different or something like that. And it's like, yes, it's a different editing software. So a little bit more about Darktable. Project started in 2009. It's currently at version 4.2, which just released. It's got a few different things on it. It's got digital asset management, which is file management, tagging, things like that, organization. If you take a lot of photos, you need to have a way to find things quickly. It's got that, got raw development, which we just talked about, where you can take your raw camera photo and make a JPEG or a PNG file that can then be displayed on the web or sent to a printer or something like that. Extensive masking support. This is really kind of neat. It really you can mask any module, so you can paint in effects, you can dodge and burn right into it, and I mean any module, white, like, you know, you can paint in white balance in just one part of the photo with the new color calibration module. Linux is kind of famous, and open source software is kind of, I guess, claim to fame as reviving old hardware. You know, everyone's like, "Oh, I've got this old soup can. I'm gonna stick Linux on it." This is not one of those cases. Um, Image manipulation is a lot of math. Camera sensors have a lot of pixels. You know, I've got one that's 45 megapixels. That's a lot of data to push around when you're doing a lot of sharpening or color adjustments on it. And so this needs a little bit of a stout machine. You know, they're recommended, I think, right now as a fourth gen Intel i5 or equivalent or newer, and a 4 gigabyte GPU. Darktable is GPU aware, so it can make use of uh, NVIDIA CUDA or AMD ROCm, and use your GPU to accelerate some tasks. You can run it without a GPU and just on the CPU. It depends on how stout your CPU is. I do recommend, you know, it's thankfully GPU prices are coming back down. Either getting a laptop with like a GTX 1650 or something in that range that's fairly. It doesn't have to be like a excuse me, turbo gaming GPU. It can be pretty basic, but it will really help speed up some operations. Um, so talk about this a little bit more. So a note on display referred versus scene referred. This goes back to the raw development a little bit. So scene referred versus display referred. What's that mean? There is a hubbub about this. Darktable uses a scene referred workflow by default. And this is where the new technology and the new display and output stuff comes into effect. On this display referred side, which is what we've been doing in the digital photography world for probably, you know, 25 years since I've been into it, definitely since I've been into it. Filmmaking's a little bit ahead of this. If you use DaVinci Resolve and some other film editing packages, they've been doing the scene referred for quite a while now. In fact, a lot of filmmakers, when they start, I hear this out of some filmmaker people who get into still photography, and they're like, this is not the correct colorway to do this, when looking at some of the proprietary packages from what they're used to. But the difference here is where this transform from the camera to the display color space is. Your raw file, you know, I'm talking about bit depths earlier. So, you know, your raw files are 12 or 14 bit depth. Most displays are 8. If you spent a lot on money, a lot of money on a display, maybe you have a 10-bit display and, you know, 12-bit stuff's coming out, but still, that's still less than your raw file holds. So this transform is important because it takes the color and the brightness data and smashes it down into something your display can show, or your printer can actually print. Our outputs are less advanced than our inputs at this point. And where that happens in the pipeline is the difference between these two. The scene referred is the new approach for photography and has been in the video world for a while now. And that display transition or transform happens right here at the end, right before the displayed image. And the display referred, which is where we're used to working, is it happens here at the start. Why this is important is this takes linear data. So sensors record things in linear, you know, X equals Y. Um, you know, human vision works on a logarithmic scale. So this takes linear data and makes it nonlinear. If you can do your grading and corrections on the linear mathematical space on your source raw, you get fewer color errors. You get fewer, you get fewer like artifacts and bad effects on it. The longer you can keep this data in this linear space here, the better off you are. The other side of this, I mentioned HDR displays, high dynamic range displays. Technology is advancing. You may edit a photo today to display, to give a print to your family member or your friend, or to display on an 8-bit display. And you may set the dynamic range and make it look good on that. 5 years down the road, you may get an HDR display and need to make an adjustment as to your white and black points and stuff like that. In the scene referred workflow, you just have to mess with this transform spot here, this one spot, which is literally one module in Darktable, and just to make that adjustment, and it's not going to impact color grading and corrections up here. Whereas on the display referred side, if in 5 years you get that fancy new display, you transform. If you edit that transform here and your dynamic range on your output, that's going to mess with your color grading and corrections, and so you're going to spend more time here adjusting for the newer stuff. So that's why that's important. And why does this matter? Well, as camera sensor technology progresses and new tools and approaches are needed. Again, we're getting deep dynamic range out of cameras. Display technology is advancing. And stuff like that. We need these new tools to be able to really harness what the camera is able to output, and to be able to make it viewable on newer HDR displays and things that are coming out. Huge shifts and twists have become so common in digital imaging that many have believed it was the correct way. I remember when I first started working in a scene referred space, I was like, "What? This looks funny to me," and that's because it takes care of using this scene referred workflow and the filmic transfer. It keeps these color ratios the same. So over here on the scene referred input, this is what your camera sensor here, forget the fancy words here. I stole this off of Stack Overflow because it was useful. But let's say you have a hypothetical cloud scene here. This is say you took this photo. This is really a painting, but whatever. And this is what the camera saw. We have 3 color primaries. You have red, green, and blue in any camera sensor. That's how it makes a color. So it saw all of this blue, a little bit of green, a little bit of red. You always got to mix something in there. Things are very rarely purely one hue. And so the traditional old sRGB transfer is just this. And as you notice, it just goes straight 1 for 1. So it keeps the green and the red at the same amount, but it does something called clipping. So it throws away all of this blue data, which causes a hue shift. You cannot, anybody who remembers maybe even thinking back to high school or elementary school, if you messed with paint, if you're mixing paints together, if you change the amount of a certain color, it's going to change the hue. It's going to mess with things. And so if you look at specifically, sunsets are really bad for this. Probably in fact, that's what I have next in the slides here. If you clip that blue or that red or that out of there, that changes the hue. And so a lot of times you'll see in digital images, if you look at a sky, it goes from darker blue, lighter blue, and then all of a sudden it shifts to cyan. And that's not correct. So if you take a dark color and you increase the exposure of it, you increase the lightness, it should just go dark blue, lighter blue, lighter blue, lighter blue, and all the way to white. It should just be a smooth transition. It shouldn't shift into cyan. And that's what happens because you're clipping all of this blue data is gone away. And so, if you add more green relative to blue, you get cyan. Or as one of our tickets at work the other day, they were asking for more cayenne toner in the printer, and I'm not making that up. Anyway, so whereas a filmic transfer takes this sensor data from your camera and smashes it down into something your display can see, but it keeps the ratios consistent, so the hue doesn't shift or twist. And so the colors are actually more accurate. And if you look at the reason why I put an old painting here, if you look at old paintings, this is for some reason this error I'm not sure exactly why, but this error in color has been around since digital. We forgot this in digital photography, that, or in digital imaging, that that hue twists don't happen in real life. But painters knew it. If you look at a painting, from the 20th century or before, if they painted a sky or a sunset, it didn't, the sky doesn't shift to cyan. If they lightened it up, it went from dark blue to light blue. This hue shift problem is a purely, uh, you know, from a digital representation of the real world. And we've just it's jarring. I'm under 40. And if you're under 40, you've lived with these digital images all your life um, with this error in them. And when you first realize it, you start seeing it everywhere, and you're like, oh yeah, that's not right. And you look at the real sky, and you're like, oh yeah, that's totally not right. I'm gonna show you an example from my own work here. Um, so this is Darktable. This is without a filmic transform. This is just straight to sRGB. And you notice here, this is a sunset, and you see this red shifts into yellow. Very common error because of the way sRGB gamut is. It's elongated, and so red gets clipped first. But the atmosphere, the sunset's red. You should not hue shift to yellow. You should just straight through into light red into white. And if you apply a filmic transform, which is just cutting on the filmic module, it sounds fancy, but it's literally clicking a box. You see how it just kind of goes from a darker kind of red to a lighter red to white, which is more realistic, more kind of correct mathematically. This is, I think, where the open source world really shines. We wouldn't have this in a photography world, I don't think, if it wasn't for Darktable and open source stuff. Adobe is so Adobe and a lot of the other proprietary ones are so kind of mired in backwards compatibility, managing customers' expectations with this stuff, that they can't go off and kind of have a fit at years of incorrect color and try to fix it. Whereas Darktable, you get a couple of angry nerds and and they fix this stuff. So that's why I think this stuff is important. We get changes, we get improvements that you just don't see in proprietary software outside of the vendor lock-in and owning your own data, which I think is also very important. So I'm going to do a little bit of editing and kind of show how to use the program, but that's to me, that's a really important progress that's been made in this software that we didn't see out of the monopolistic Adobe and companies that are kind of mired in the way that they've done things and have not been forced to innovate. What does the future hold? Darktable still has a lot of legs left in it. There's a couple of forks of it out there now, but we've seen new features. We're actually just got a new tone mapper. Technically, what the filmic module is called a tone mapper because it takes the camera file and maps it out into a something your display can show. But it is a bit complicated. It does take some reading. We just got a new one, a contribution from another developer, and it's the sigmoid tone mapper. And it does the same thing. It respects the color ratios correctly, but it's just a bit more easier. And I think it does a fantastic job if you're just looking to make like a quick JPEG for Instagram or something. So there's new features coming. It's got a vibrant community. There's 2 releases a year. I think GPU hardware is going to continue to be paramount. In fact, the person who founded the Darktable project, Joe, his name's Joe, but he goes by Hanatos online. He started a project. He left the Darktable team a few years ago to kind of, if you spend almost a decade running a project, you kind of want to do something different. He actually wrote and recently released a tool called VKDT, which stands for Vulkan Darktable. And this requires a GPU entirely. It's a node-based editor. It's kind of, it's version 0.5 now, so it's still kind of rough around the edges. I've been playing with it a little bit, but it happens entirely on the graphics card. And where I was saying before, with Darktable doing a lot of complex math, some of these modules can really take a while to, not a while, but a couple seconds to render. And with VKDT, if you've got a Vulkan capable graphics card, it's instant. This stuff just happens in real time. So I think that's really going to become the future. On the hardware side, I really see cameras becoming more specialty and professionally focused. Everyone's singing the death knell of the camera industry because of smartphones. But I think if you look at the curve of sales, the last 20 years have really been an aberration. We're just kind of returning to normal there. Sales are back down to where they were in the 90s when really just professionals were buying SLRs and stuff like that, and hobbyists and artists and stuff. I think we're just kind of returning to normal. The last 20 years has been kind of an aberration, an explosion. And now that everyone can get nice photos out of their phone, we're just going to see these camera companies shift more into making tools that are better suited for enthusiasts and professional people. We'll probably see more AI features in the cameras and stuff like that. I think Canon already does something with autofocus trained on machine learning and stuff like that. So I think they'll just become more professional tools instead of, you'll see the lower end stuff fall away because, people just, and most people just want nice photos from their phone. But that's kind of the end of the slides here. I'll get into showing the software. Is there any questions before any of that? Anybody still awake? Maybe. Okay. So.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So if you are a proprietary software user like Adobe Photoshop, and you take pictures of sunsets, are all your sunsets inaccurate? And is there a way to do it accurately with like Adobe software, or do you have to fire up something else?
So last time I used Lightroom was version 5.7. Back then, yes. Adobe doesn't release their source code. I don't know how they're doing it now. And once you learn to spot hue shifts, it's easy to look at. So I would take a sunset photo, put it in the Lightroom and Photoshop, and see if you get that kind of yellow or that blue to cyan hue shift. And if that's the case, then yes, that's technically mathematically kind of wrong. I've seen some film people, I know you're a film guy, film buff, use DaVinci Resolve to actually edit photos because it uses the same approach as Darktable and Blender does too, to get the more accurate colors out of it. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's a way in the Adobe world to correct with it because it's a pipeline problem. It's not like you can apply a filter and fix it. It's like an MP3. You can't take an MP3 and then reconstruct a CD out of it terribly accurate. Once that data is thrown away, it's thrown away in the pipeline. My answer to you is I'm not sure. I haven't used Photoshop extensively in some time, but I would look at some of your files in there and see if you're getting those hue shifts. And if you are, I would say, yeah, that's definitely a display referred approach still. The reason why this stuff came into Darktable is one of the developers got sick of dealing with it in proprietary software. And so he was like, fine, they aren't fixing it, I'm going to do it. But that was like 5 years ago now. So they may have fixed it since then. But yeah, so that would be the thing. I would look for hue shifts. I'm pretty sure, just from other Lightroom users and Photoshop users, though, I'm pretty sure that they still use a display referred approach in that software. So, but yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Leander, this is probably a bad question, but is there still a market for SLR cameras? Are they still being worked on and developed, or are they pretty much toast?
SLRs are pretty much toast. The new hotness is mirrorless cameras, which you get the interchangeable lenses, but instead of having the mirror box, you get a little digital LCD display in your viewfinder that you hold to your eye. Mechanically, they're a bit simpler. Camera companies, the mirror flippy bit is a complicated mechanical thing that can wear out and break. Without that in there, they're a bit more robust. They're easier to make. The camera companies like them because mechanical things are easier to make. But yeah, SLRs, Canon and Nikon, I think, were the last ones still making them, and they both said that they are ending development of them. They still sell a couple of models, but they're several years old at this point. I still use a lot of SLRs because I like the optical viewfinder, but I have mirrorless stuff too. But yeah, SLRs, the professional camera is not dead, but the SLR is, and its replacement is mirrorless cameras.
What kind of SLR do you use? Or do you have any recommendations or any ideas on that?
I've got Nikon stuff. I've got Fujifilm mirrorless stuff, but I've got Nikon SLRs. You could probably get them on Fire. I've been picking up some F-mount lenses lately just because people are switching to mirrorless, and so they're selling their old stuff. So that would be Nikon, Canon. I feel like have been really nice cameras made. I don't think you can buy a bad camera in that time frame. So if you find one used on your local Facebook marketplace or Craigslist and it's a good deal, I would say grab it. If you aren't already married to a system, they're all pretty good these days.
Leander, this is Dan.
Yeah.
You mentioned Blender in your presentation. To
Yes.
what degree have you used Blender? I used it a few years ago. I was really impressed with it.
I used it. So Blender has a little tiny video editing like module in it, and I've used it to edit video before. I'm not really a 3D modeling person, but I've used it to edit video a few times.
So have I.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Any other questions or anything? Okay. Well, let me end this screen sharing and change over. Let me see here. Stop sharing. I need to close this. Just one moment. I think. Yes. And start sharing your screen. There. All right. So I've just picked a few photos to look at here in Darktable with, to give us a little bit of time afterwards if anybody has any questions or anything. This is the Darktable interface in 4.2.0. You've got a timeline down here that shows what your photos are when your photos are taken. It looks, if you've ever used Adobe Lightroom, it looks very similar, but I think that resemblance is kind of only skin deep. This is the light table side of it, which is where you can apply tags. So here you can look at your tagging and apply. These are metadata tags, so you can search for this later on when you can't find anything anymore. When you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of photos, you can edit your metadata and move your images around and all that stuff here. There's a nice feature. I actually made a video about this years ago, but where you can actually, the way I store my photos these days is I keep them on a network attached storage NAS, and I copy them locally when I want to work on them. And so you can actually keep your Darktable files remotely on a big old fat hard drive on a NAS or something, and then plug in your laptop, click this copy locally. It'll make a little, if you've got a set of photos you want to edit those on your laptop. And then when you go back to your network and plug it in, you can sync those edits back to your big old fat NAS and kind of have them in a big storage pool. So that's kind of a neat feature. But so yeah, this is just kind of the kind of moving around informational kind of side of things. You've got up here across the top, you've got several modules. The big ones are Lightroom and Lighttable and Darkroom. The Darkroom is where you do your editing. Over here, you've got the map, geotagging, print. So you can print from Darktable. Again, depending on your OS support. Slideshow and tethering. The tethering is actually, I think they're looking at removing it because it's kind of flaky and doesn't really work that well. And I think it's just a front end for Gphoto too. Excuse me. So it's really on the way out. But basically, the Lighttable and the Darkroom are kind of the meat and potatoes here. And so if you want to edit a photo, you can simply click the Darkroom button there, and it'll bring it into this Darkroom here. And you'll notice on the side here, you've got your image information. You can collapse that down just by clicking on it. Mask Manager, all this stuff, color picker for doing white balance and stuff like that. Whenever you open a file here, you get this history stack, and Darktable, like most raw editors, is non-destructive, meaning this raw file here that's on my disk is always going to be preserved in its most pristine format. Darktable is going to store these edits in a sidecar file, which is just an XML file, and put those edits, and then take the raw file, take the edits, combine them, and then put out a JPEG that you can then share. So it's nice and non-destructive like that. So you've kind of got a default set of things that have to happen to take a raw file and display it as an image. You got to demosaic it. You've got to assign an input and output color profiles. So these are kind of exposure, tone map, and stuff like that. So these are kind of the basic set of things to take a raw file and display it on a screen. If you open a JPEG in Darktable, which you can edit JPEGs in Darktable if you want, you won't see this history stack here because it's, a JPEG you just open, it's done. So anyway, over here on the left, you've got your histogram, which again, this is your highlights, and this is your shadows. In fact, if you adjust your exposure module here, you can kind of increase your exposure. You can see that histogram going overexposed and clipping off to the right here. And you can also drag it the other way, and you can see it go all the way down to black. And you can see just how much the wide range of data that's available in this file. This is from a D800, a Nikon D800, which is a 10-year-old camera now, but it still has about 13-ish stops of dynamic range. So you can see all the detail that's actually located in the file that the display cannot show at once. I opened this one first because I want to show the over and under exposure indicators down here. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you've got this checkerboard looking thing here, and that's the raw overexposed indicator. And if you click that, it gives you this pattern on your image. That indicates that this file was overexposed at the time of capture. This data here is thrown away. There's nothing. The camera couldn't capture anything here. It's not there. There are ways in Darktable and Raw Therapy to do highlight reconstruction where it can do some interpolation and kind of put something back there in a way. It kind of works. It kind of doesn't. That's one thing Adobe really does have better. Their highlight reconstruction is a little bit better than this is, but it's getting it. 4.2 added some features, and that's different from the display. This here is the display indication for clipping. So blue means that it's underexposed. In fact, I can add it here, and you can see the blue goes away, and the red means it's overexposed as far as the display tone mapping. So, that's what that means. So when I'm talking about clipping, that's what I'm talking about, is that it's blown out. There's nothing there. So let's kind of show you that. Here's one. I was up there bracketing for an HDR. So I took exposures when I did this photo a few years ago. I took exposures, underexposed, medium exposed, and then overexposed. So this is one that's a little bit better exposed. And you can see if I click the raw photo, the raw kind of exposure here, there's no clipping, there's data throughout the whole file. So we can now use Darktable to really extract suck all of the marrow out of this photo, as it were, to get everything looking better. So you see here the mountains are kind of in shadow. There's not really much going on. So what we can do here, I'm going to cut on the clipping indicators, and I'm going to drag the exposure up, and we're starting to clip, but I'm going to try to get some more detail in those mountains a little bit. You can see we're starting to come up, starting to get a little bit of detail here in the fog and the trees. I'm going to go in here and Filmic RGB, which is the tone mapper. And this is the thing that actually takes the raw file and makes it into something your display can handle. And so you've got your white and your black exposure. So this is your black point. And so if you move this slider up and down, you can see that the blacks are getting more dense and darker. So this gives you more room in your shadows versus takes room out. Same thing with the white relative exposure. It gives you a little bit more room. So I'm going to adjust that so we don't get any clipping. And these are measured distance from zero. Anybody remember absolute values from, ninth grade math class, maybe? So this is 7.3 EVs from center. Center is like your 18% gray, right? It's your middle exposure, and black is the same thing. So, this is negative that many EV away. So you can see this camera's got quite the range here. Right. So the other thing I really mess with in here is the looks. So this is where you can add contrast, and you can kind of borrow some from the shadows or the highlights. So the balance is like where it adds contrast to. So if we go here to the shadows side, you get a little bit more room in the shadows at the cost of the highlights, and vice versa. Again, we're making basic kind of adjustments here. And trade-offs based on what our display can show. So you can come in here and get that. There's another module I like to use for getting more detail out of it, and it's under the grading side here, and it's the tone equalizer. And again, we'll go ahead and cut it on and mask it to bring it into the thing there, into the view. And so this is just like your histogram up here. Shadows live over here. The lights live over here. I might get that a little bit more centered up, right? And so you can just drag this up to make your shadows brighter. So it's just like an equalizer on a piece of audio gear, right? Or if you want to make your highlights a little bit more, you want to compress that dynamic range into something your display can show. We're going to bring in some lights there. And it gives you very fine control. This is reminiscent of the Ansel Adams zone system. So you can really get in there and kind of make everything kind of pop. You want to add some saturation, color balance. In fact, there's a setting. I just come in here and click that to use vibrant colors. You can adjust chroma and saturation. I give it a little bit more chroma to make it pop a little bit more vibrance. This is just kind of a season to taste. That's a bit much, but we might do a little bit less on the shadows. Get a little bit of color in there, and we're gonna go into white. You can adjust your white balance. I think it's pretty good here, but there are ways, if your color temperature is a little off, you can warm it or whatnot. I think it looks pretty good, so I'm going to leave it there. We'll go ahead and crop it. And this is a search box here, so even if you don't know where the module is in here, you can just type crop, and it brings it right up. And we're just going to crop it down because I don't think that's really well composed. We'll kind of do that, bring it in here. Right, there we go. So we get a little bit more detailed. So we've gone. That was our initial photo. Nothing in the mountains here, no color, no nothing. To this, where we've got details, you can see the fog. This isn't like the best edit in the world. I think maybe I overdid that a little bit. I might pick the setting, the preset. If you click the hamburger menu there, you kind of get some presets that are built in, and turn that down a little bit. We're kind of getting a little bit on the masking there. So bring the shadows down a little bit more, add a little bit more contrast. But we've got a good edit there in a few steps. And now we have detail down here that was in the raw file. It was in the file the whole time, but if you relied on the camera to pick that for you, this is what the camera decided. If you got a JPEG out of the camera, it'd be pretty close to this, and so you'd be losing all that information there. Whereas if you have a raw image and you can come into here and do this manipulation, you can get that data back. Any questions on this kind of basic raw processing? And once you're done with that and happy with it, you can come out to here in the light table, and you can just export it. And if I can click there today, you can export it. I have my export location to be my Nextcloud instance, but you can export as a JPEG, PNG. Excuse me. Little frog in my throat there. TIFF, WebP, all of the formats. there are options to export to, you can do a LaTeX book template. Send us an email, a website gallery, so it'll generate like a little website for you. You can just upload with FTP or SCP. Pewigio, I don't know how to say that, but that's a self-hosted. I have one of those. It's a online web gallery you can host on a web server, so you can export to a few different things and share your image with a lot of people. But this really shows the power, I think, of Darktable. I'll show you the new tone mapper. So we can cut filmic RGB, and we are back. So we've cut off filmic. I'm going to show the new tone mapper, which this is also a scene referred tone mapper, but instead of having all the controls of filmic, you just have a few here. So you can skew your compression towards the shadows of the highlights. So if you come to the highlights, you get more contrast in the highlights, just like that one slider, or you get more contrast in the shadows and the highlights look flatter. You have a contrast adjustment, and you can deal with your hue twisting here. So if you're okay with some hue twist, the nice thing about Darktable is if you want a hue twist, let's say you like that look, you can get it. You can just shut this setting all the way down to 0 and you get that yellow cheap beer looking sunset or sunrise. If you like that, the choice is yours. Or you can preserve the hue all the way up and get the right, the mathematically correct color or somewhere in between. You've got that option. The choice is yours. The software is not, you are driving. The software is just, it's the software is your tool. You're not the software's tool. Well, maybe I'm kind of a tool. So anyway, but it's a joke. So Sigmoid, I like for beginners a little bit more because it's a little bit less confusing. There's fewer controls and you can still use the exposure and the tone equalizer. My favorite module, I think, is the tone equalizer because that is a magnificent representation of adjusting shadows and highlights. You can just drag it up and down, and just like I said, just like an audio equalizer, if you're experimenting that, and just have very fine grained control of every tonal range in the photo instead of an arbitrary slider that's shadows and highlights and stuff like that. I guess I could talk about the masking a little bit. Darktable has very powerful masking tools. You can mask so I'm going to make a new exposure module here. You can duplicate any instance, so you can have multiple instances, and you can come in here and you can see that there's masking uniformly, drawn mask. There's something called a parametric mask. So if we come into here and cut on mask refinement, parametric masks, you can only apply to certain pixels of certain values. So say I just want to adjust the exposure in the bright parts of the image, I can come in here and bring my clipping all the way up. So that means this module is only going to impact pixels in this range of values. I'll cut off my mask refinement here. And now if I adjust the exposure, this is a gross exaggeration, don't do this because it looks bad, but you can just affect that area of the image. That's very powerful. You can do it by color, you can do it by brightness level, you can do drawn, and you can combine drawn and parametric masks. So you can just come in here with a pencil and you can do a gradient mask here. So we'll kill the parametric. I'm just going to reset that. Yoink, and you can come in here and do a gradiated filter and just do that half of the image. You can come in here and do like dodging and burning, and you can do this on any module, not just exposure. You can come in here and do like that and just have it do that part of the image. You can invert the mask. In fact, this is how I do an artificial vignette. A lot of times I'll paint in some exposure and invert the mask. But very powerful tools right in Darktable that you do not, if you make a mistake, you just right click and it goes away. And I think in Lightroom, really doesn't exist. I don't know. JB may know more. I know he uses Premiere and stuff about that modern. It's been, like I said, it's been a hot minute since I've used Lightroom. So, but yeah, so it's very powerful. We are at about an hour now. Is anybody have any questions? I open the floor to discussions or anything like that.
Yeah, Leander.
Yeah.
And again, I've looked at DaVinci Resolve, Blackmagic's DaVinci Resolve years ago, and
Yep.
the only problem I had with it was so GPU intensive. None of my hardware would run it. It's really designed for Windows and Mac, but Linux will run it, certain distros. But I'll tell you what, I have heard of Darktable.
Mhm.
From what you've demonstrated here, this is impressive.
Well, thank you.
I really like it.
I can't take credit for it. I'm not a developer. I just report bugs and
Yeah.
and use it. But yeah, thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it's powerful. It isn't as GPU dependent. Having a GPU helps. Don't get me wrong, but you can do it without a GPU. And it also depends. The system requirements are not hard and fast. It depends on what RAW file you're bringing into it. So if you have a higher resolution camera, you're going to need more computer to push them pixels. If you've got an older camera that's maybe 10 or 12 megapixels, you can do it on a lower end machine fine. So, you know, more pixels, more pewter. That's the way I would say it.
Can you hook up Darktable to a lot of platforms like DaVinci Resolve does? You know, consoles?
No, it's pretty self-contained. It does have a
Okay.
Lua scripting capability where you can like write a Lua script to
Lua, yeah.
to hook up to other things. But by default, it's kind of a build your own adventure in that one. But
Okay.
I call this the Linux of photo editing, and I mean that lovingly. In that you can kind of hang yourself.
Well, I'll tell you what, for free, it's excellent.
It is. It's great.
It's
I do.
impressive.
Yeah. And raw therapy, if you're want something a little bit more beginner friendly, check out the Sigmoid module. If that's still not your thing, check out Raw Therapy. They just had a new release, version 5.9. They now have local adjustments, just like Darktable. I've been playing with it, and it's a little bit more industry compatible in its language, I would say. You know, I mean, it's got the highlight sliders and stuff like that. So if you're used to the more industry standard photography tools, it's a little bit more probably easier to pick up. And it's, again, runs on all these tools run on Mac and Linux and Windows. You don't have to have a Linux desktop. I do because I want to, but yeah. It's I would recommend looking at Raw Therapy. I could talk about that the next time. I'm not as much as a Raw Therapy user. I'm definitely more in the Darktable thing, but
Right.
yeah. So, but yeah, DaVinci Resolve definitely I think requires a GPU. So,
Oh yeah, it's definitely.
any other questions or anything?
Yes, Leander, this is Alan.
Hi.
Can you recommend any particularly good books on Darktable or even online?
Oh God,
how-to
yes.
resources?
There are. There's the Darktable manual. If you go to darktable.org, and there's a, I'll put it here. Table. I'll put it in chat here for you. Resources, user manual. The user manual is still version 4.0. They haven't updated it for 4.2 yet, but it'll get you down the road. I have a YouTube channel and stuff where I do talk and make videos about it. If you go on YouTube and just search Darktable, you'll find myself. You'll find one of the developers of Darktable who actually just forked it out of a rage of. Anyway, open source. There's still plenty of open source project drama if that's your thing. But one of the developers has videos. There's a guy named Bruce Williams. There was a young lady too. I just know her username. It's like Chicago Photo Slinger or something. I forget her actual name. I'm bad about that. I'll remember screen names easier. I'm a child of the internet. But she used to do like live Twitch editing streams in Darktable and was quite good at it. But yeah, so there are plenty of resources out there. There's not like a good book on it, but there's also this forum. There's, of course, Darktable mailing lists. There's this forum here that's kind of the unofficial, officially unofficial support forum for these tools, and I'm on there sometimes answering questions or asking questions. And that's another good resource too. So yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question for you, Leander.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could describe what you are doing to manage your inventory of photos that have never received all of this artistic attention, yet you are holding them for their value. And I bring up two sort of issues. One would be like professional photographers who might have like 10 or 20 years of Friday night football photos from a local school, or a scientist who may have thousands of photos on some natural phenomenon. And some of these might also be a collective, group, group sourced. And the processing and review of these inventories very likely could benefit from web access and sort of crowdsourcing for bringing to the surface whatever needs the attention that you have just demonstrated from Darktable. In other words, there's sort of these two worlds. There's this background inventory, and then there's the photo that receives attention, maybe attention on a raw file, because it has been pulled from inventory. And then the final example I'll mention is forensics and legal use, where provenance of a file is important, and you need to at least demonstrate that the file that you are examining has not been tampered with, that it was, it has a time stamp and it has a provenance of non-alteration. So anyway, you can just, if you might respond generally in this problem area.
Sure.
So this is not the artistic management of one photo, but it is the management of a professional collection or a semi-professional collection.
Yeah. So I myself personally, I've been organizing my files on disk for 15 years or so, and digital asset management is part of the Darktable package. And really, that should be a part of your process. There are programs when you ingest a photo, which is like when you take your compact flash, that's old now, but your SD card, and plug it into your card reader, you plug your camera into your computer, and bring it in. There's a program called Raw Photo Downloader where you can have it tag and organize into a directory. I just do that manually. So if you look on my screen here, I've got several different directories, and these are just directories on disk. And so, they're all collapsed down now, but I've got photos by year, and then like I'll go into here like 2023 one, and I have a folder with a directory, excuse me, I've been around Windows users too much, a directory with all of these with a meaningful name that I have assigned to it, and I put the photos in there so I can find them. The next thing I use is tagging. So when I import something, I'll check this box and I'll apply metadata. So I'll come into here, and if you're doing Friday night football, you could say, high school, high school football sports. So you would give it some tags. I'm not a football player. I don't know. What's a good football word? Quarterback, touchdown? Anyway, but so you would give it some meaningful tags. So then you can come into here later and you can then narrow down this rule, and you can narrow it down by a tag, description, title, date, publisher, capture time, capture date. So you have organization tools. You have to put a little bit of forethought into it. It's sort of like a filing cabinet. You know, if you've got important papers, you need to put them in some way that makes sense to you to organize them. But the software can help with that. If you're like, gosh, I shot this football game in 2005, but I don't remember exactly thing, you can just narrow it down by 2005, maybe put you know, so you can say, you can drop down here and you can go by capture date. You can select 2005 from the list, and then you can narrow down this search, and then you can say, well, I'm looking for football photos from 2005. You can then put a tag in here and you can type football. I've never shot any football photos. So that would give you all of that. So that would let you drill down. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that,
yeah. You're not using Digicam for this purpose. You're using something called Raw Photo Downloader.
Raw Photo Downloader, I don't use it, but that's a popular one. Digicam you can use too. There are multiple products, I guess, or projects, software projects that allow you to do that. I personally just use the file browser. I mount my card like an external disk, and I just grab the files and chuck them in a folder. But you can use one of those programs. Some people like them because they're a bit more automated. When I was shooting professionally, they were more useful. Like if you're shooting weddings or something like that, and you shoot like 2 a weekend or something, you can have it automatically do things. And the nice thing about Raw Photo Downloader is if you're doing something like that, so you're on a site and you want to back up, this is where I found it useful. You're shooting someone's wedding. If, you know, the dog eats your compact flash SD CF Express card, their photos are gone and you're in trouble. So, you know, I'd take a laptop with me and an external drive, and I'd plug it in. I'd use Raw Photo Downloader to copy to the internal drive on the laptop, and then make an instant backup copy to the hard drive as it was moving. So you had the copy on the card, you had the copy on the hard drive, and you had the copy on the laptop automatically. So that way, you know, you don't lose their valuable picture. So it's good for things like that's what I used it for. On my home machine with my organization, I kind of just do it by hand. I think the word for that is artisanal these days. Anyway, artisanal photo curation on my home machine. So, so, yep. But yeah, Darktable can help you. It's just a matter of you kind of have to pre-plan a little bit. And this is where we run into problems with the younger. This is another kids these days rant, but you know, working with students and stuff, I've noticed that they're used to their phones just giving them a bucket of photos and being able to search through it and stuff like that. And so it's difficult to explain this process of, well, you kind of have to think about it and organize it a little bit on these programs. But if you do it right, if you tag and make a sensible storage structure, it's not too hard to use. So on the provenance side, I only know a few photojournalists, but the ones I know who, you've got two sides of photojournalism. You've got editorial photography, which is like your Life magazine, your National Geographics. Provenance isn't as important there. They're more artistic in nature. Whereas if you've got the newspaper, provenance is really important. And I've found that a lot of places where the provenance is important, excuse me, hang on. Where the provenance is important, they just use a camera JPEG. There are ways in the cameras to set creator data, copyright data and stuff, and it automatically imprints it to the file. And you just, in fact, a lot of the higher end cameras now have Wi-Fi or an Ethernet jack. Even I think like the Nikon Z9 has like an Ethernet jack. And so if you're shooting a sporting event or something critical, you can just hook it up and upload. These news agencies have their own systems for doing that stuff. So usually if it's provenance is critical, if you're taking a picture of a politician doing a very bad thing and, they want proof that it wasn't faked, then, it usually will not touch raw processing. It's a straight out of camera JPEG thing. So yeah,
Yeah,
at least in my experience.
I think both in a court of law and also in the public sphere where there's liability for claiming that a picture is what it purports to be, it seems like I've never understood how the metadata is truly securely bonded in perpetuity to the pixel data. It just strikes me that the metadata is stuffed at a known part of any JPEG file or any other file that contains metadata. The metadata is in an architectural area that it seems to me could always be unjoined to the actual photo data, and furthermore, the photo data could be edited while retaining the metadata, particularly time related metadata or place related metadata, like GPS coordinates and things. I've never understood this, and it strikes me that the very big resource of there being lots of cameras all around in this world, it's sort of like a collision of potential and resources. It's more and more likely that things become edited just because the sheer mass of accumulated photos becomes greater and greater, and the mining of these photos that all largely occur in a public sphere, they're going to be mined, and then there's a higher likelihood that they will be tampered with. At least it makes you wonder where the technology will go in terms of how you define what is usable either as evidence or what is a basis of liability in publishing.
Yeah, I mean, that's really more of a legal question, I think, and it is from a technical standpoint. As anyone who's worked in information technology for a while, it's anything can be faked, and you are correct that this metadata there's no way to fully lock a file. It can always be edited. It could always be manipulated. You just have to trust the path, and that's why, straight out of camera however system they ingest it and publish it, that path is kind of their insurance policy on that, for that side of things. I think there is some work, and as much as I rag on Adobe, this is something they're doing that's beneficial to. There's something they're doing recently with being able to prove photo provenance, and I think it's going to be an open standard. So hopefully it will be integrated into other tools later on. But it is, I know Brent does some networking stuff, and anytime we get a letter that says, "Oh, well, this came from this IP address," sometimes you can, that can be faked. You can do a reflection of, so as with anything with computers, yeah, there is a trust issue there, and you can do your best to kind of work a way around it. But yeah, hopefully we'll get better at that in the future. But yeah. So, but it is a good question.
Well, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions here? I know this wasn't too Linuxy, but hopefully it was interesting.
I enjoyed the presentation. You did a great job.
Thank you.
I got a question for you, Leander.
Sure.
There was something on the internet within the last week, I believe, that they're using these kind of programs. You said they're starting to use artificial intelligence to help, do all the adjustments, but that they're using programs with artificial intelligence to generate these deep fakes. And they recommended you get all your pictures off the internet if you can. Do you have any thoughts on that?
A lot. Yes. Yeah. So the AI adjustments is a thing in that's coming into a lot of software packages now, where it can, they feed it a set of data and a set of adjustments, and that's what Adobe is probably using their automatic AI upload thing that I was talking about earlier. Is they're probably saying, oh, well, this photo was exposed in this way, and then this person made these adjustments to it, and then it's using that to train their AI to say, oh, okay, if someone has a photo that's exposed in this manner with this kind of color in it, they probably want this adjustment. And so you can audit the AI, the machine learning. I hate the term AI because it's really not AI. It's a machine learning thing. But it's a bunch of if statements chained together with vector math. But it's yeah. So those tools are, I think, probably beneficial. I'm glad that they're there, because if it gets people kind of the feet wet in the technical side of it, I don't want them to become the end all be all, because at the end of the day, the tools work for me, and I want creative control over what I'm doing. I do see their place though, and like when I was shooting weddings, I don't, I want a good result. I need it fast. This isn't like a personal project that's going in the Smithsonian. It's the fourth wedding I've shot that month. Screw it. I just want a decently looking photo. Go. It's just fire for the divorce proceedings later anyway. But anyway, that's my but the
Leander, you're such a cynic, I tell you.
So but on the AI side, yeah, I've been struggling with that late myself. The photos, online communities are a great way to share your photos, to learn, to get recognition, to get, if you're a professional, to get customers. And yet, every time you post something online these days, you're right, it feels like someone can come by and scrape it and then use it to train their algorithm, for all sorts of nefarious purposes, profiling people and things like that. And you think about, if you're a moralistic person, you kind of think, well, is that the right thing to do? And so, yeah, I struggle with that question too. I have become more selective about what I put online because of that. I don't know I have a long-term answer for that yet, to be honest, but yeah, that is something I think about too. And I bring that up with clients and stuff. Like, I take portraits and I'm like, look, you can do what you want. If you don't want me to post them online, I totally get that. I don't really put my face online too much for numerous reasons. Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know what the answer is there. On one hand, it seems like training an AI model is fair use, because humans do the same thing. When I shoot photos, I go and look on Flickr or Instagram and get ideas, get inspiration looking at other people's work, or I go and get like a book or something and read it, or a picture book, and or like a coffee table book, and look at the photos in it to get ideas and inspiration. So I'm kind of a human learning at that point. And so, is that really analogous to doing it with a machine? There's consent issues there, to some degree too, but yeah, so it's a good question. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for it. This is all very new frontier stuff. I would be, if you are taking pictures of people, maybe ask. Consent is always nice in multiple ways. And I would say, hey, I took this picture of you. Can I post it online? Are you okay with that? No pressure. I think for me, that's the appropriate way to do it. Give people the choice.
Gosh, that's a good idea. Thank you.
Leander, now you can use AI to create the picture of a person that isn't even alive.
That's correct.
It looks as good as the person who is alive. There's an area of concern right now with plagiarism in school and education with AI GPT, where students are using AI to write their papers and do things like that. So I can see where this, AI is good, but I can see where AI isn't so good. And that's an area where, we're starting to get into an area of legalism and trademarking and plagiarism and all kinds of stuff. I mean, the major news syndicates now use AI to write their articles. They don't have copywriters anymore that do that.
Yeah,
for the most part.
I guess I've stopped sharing my screen. If you guys want to turn your cameras on, you're free to do that. I guess the bandwidth concerns are kind of done, but it's an interesting. Plagiarism has been a problem for a long time. I know, working in a university, I know some kids who make beer money writing papers for high school students. So it's been a thing as old as time in some ways. But it's can't put the mustard back in the tube or whatever, but there's hopefully we'll figure it out. Oh, I think that was
My dog, sorry, I'll turn it on.
Yeah, there we go.
Another precinct heard from.
So, but yeah, it's there's a lot of technical stuff around here. There's a lot of technical questions and things moving forward, and data is the new oil, and I mean that's why I like the open source stuff. Is I feel like I can trust these programs. I feel like they aren't working against me. Adobe and Microsoft and Apple are always they're very capitalistic. They're always kind of looking for the next thing to get, to make money off of. And so they're going to, if they can grab your data and use that as a data set to train their next generation products, they're going to do it, whether you want them to or not. So it's, it's a trust issue thing, and that's why I like these programs. I feel like they're working for me, and I don't have to constantly check that they're doing something I don't want them to do. So it's a nice thing about this alternative. So,
any thoughts on astrophotography and digital SLRs versus mirrorless versus whatever? Usually you lock the mirror up anyway.
I actually, my training, I do a lot of astrophotography, or I have in the past. I didn't have any in here today, but whatever camera you got, mirrorless doesn't have the lockup thing. The newer cameras are fantastic at high ISO, so you don't really need to worry with that. I shoot some of my better astrophotography in the last few years has been at like 3200, 6400 ISO, and it's just fantastic. Wow. Yeah. Look at stacking. You can stack your there's actually an open source project called Serial for you can stack photos, astro photos, and do dark subtraction and stuff in that too. So, but I would just get a relatively modern camera. I think mirrorless is probably easier because you don't have the mirror to lock up, and it is kind of newer. It is, mirrorless cameras are traditionally a little bit smaller and lighter, and if you're using a mount or something, that's less pain in the butt to deal with. But they're all pretty good. I mean, it's hard to buy it's nice. You can't buy a crappy camera anymore hardly. They're all pretty good. So I think.
Thanks.
Leander, I have some older Nikon cameras, and I was wondering if you know of if there's any adapters that can convert those film cameras to digital. Because mainly I have a bunch of lenses, zoom and macro lenses, and I'd love to be able to use those same lenses in a digital format.
So if they're F mount, Nikon digital cameras, you can just buy a Nikon digital camera. The F mount, the D700s, the D800s, and stuff like that. They work with lenses going back to the 60s. So that would be the digital conversion, is just buy a digital Nikon SLR. I think there are companies out there that make backs for certain cameras. It's more of a medium format thing, like your Hasselblads and stuff like that, where you can buy a digital 120 back or 220 back and put in it. But there are companies out there that do that. I would, if it's a Nikon system, if the lenses are like from the 80s or the 90s, I'd just buy a D800 or a D8, something like that, and go to town.
Leander, can you describe what I thought I heard you say? Mirror lift as a type of technology. And I did a word search on mirror lift camera and didn't come up with much.
It's mirrorless. Mirrorless.
Oh, mirrorless.
Yeah.
Oh. Yes. Well, I thought, what's the difference between a single lens reflex and a mirror lift?
Yeah.
I figured, isn't there a lifted mirror in a single lens reflex? So
nope.
No mirror.
No mirror. Yep. So
okay.
That's the new thing. You know, you just have a screen. The screen reads right off of the sensor on the eyepiece, and you don't have a mirror or anything. There are advantages. They are a lot faster because you don't have to flip that mirror up out of the way. You can get like even cheap mirrorless cameras are just insane frame rate. So if you birds, sports, fast moving things, they just fly. Yeah.
Hey, Leander.
Yep. We're getting some feedback again.
Yeah. Is it?
There it goes. It's better now. Yeah.
Okay. I have a D40 and I still use it in low light level conditions. It's only, I think, an 8 megapixel sensor, but it's a standard, whatever the size of the sensor is, so that each pixel is larger, much larger than these, 4K sensors. And to me, it seems I get much better sensitivity in low light conditions. Any thoughts on that?
The D40 is quite old now, but yeah, so sensor size matters. You've got the D40 is a what's called a crop frame. It's a DX, so it's a 1.5 crop from a 35 millimeter, but it's still much larger than the photo sites are much larger than a cell phone or on the 40. And a full frame camera like a D700 or a D800 or something like that is even larger pixels. And what you're dealing with is you're a radio person, so I know you know about SNR, signal to noise. So
yes. Yeah.
And that's why you get better low light out of a larger sensor, because your pixels are larger. And just like on a radio thing, JB's also a ham. He does ham radio videos on YouTube, by the way, Pete, if you want to bother him.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So sorry, JB, I'm getting you in trouble. But
no problem. I have my AMSAT head on here, so
he's but the so signal to noise ratio, if your photo site is larger, it's going to catch more photons landing on it. And sensors have inherent noise. There's op amps and stuff in there, and electronics which produce noise, which can affect the pixels of the photo sites, or pixels on a screen, photo site on a sensor. And so if you have a larger photo site, you've got more surface area to gather more light, and so your signal is going to be higher relative to your noise, and so it's going to produce a cleaner image. So that's why, that's my thought on that. And the at 10 years ago, there was the megapixel wars where there were, you know, they were just making like huge sensors and or hugely resolution sensors. And as you go up in resolution, your photo site gets smaller and your signal to noise drops. And so those are noisier at higher ISOs. The D40 is kind of old now. I think you're going to see a massive improvement. Just like a D7500 or something like that is going to be a massive.
I've got a 50.
Yep.
I've got a 5100 also.
Okay, yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, it's just physics, really. I mean, it's the same sort of stuff as like in radio, you know, with signal to noise. Right. Yep. So, did I answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. You can do some interesting math. The way that, you know, cell phones today take amazing pictures, and, you know, they've got a sensor in them that's a quarter of a pinky nail. And the way they do it is they take multiple, you know, you hit the button and they take multiple exposures at multiple different settings and then combine them into a final photo, and you can do some math and subtract some noise and stuff like that. So there are ways around physics in the computer world. And that's really what you're doing with astrophotography and stacking and dart subtraction and stuff, is dealing with the noise. So, but yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, speaking of signal to noise ratio, I was watching Gerald Undone on YouTube. He does camera reviews, and he's basically like a numbers guy.
All right.
And he started talking about SNR, and I immediately was like, oh, wait a minute. Like, cameras are kind of like radios for light, you know? They're just sensors, you know, detecting signals.
In fact, this poster behind me here is the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and radio and light are the same thing, just different wavelengths. I mean, yeah. Radio is just longer wavelength light. I mean, I'm an astronomer by training, and we call it all light. So yeah, yeah. It's
called electromagnetism.
So yeah, good questions. I hope I helped explain some things today, and how being on Linux doesn't really hobble you in the creative way. It does take some learning. I always tell people Darktable has a VI-like learning curve. It's like, oh, this is kind of like what I remember. Oh, Lord, this is a wall, and you hit it, and then you kind of just have to work through it. But it's powerful software, and I really do think that I'm able to do pretty cool things with it. I don't feel hobbled really by my choice of doing this. So I think it's valuable to go out and show it and talk about how you can get these results. So,
well, thanks, Leander. Does anyone have any last questions on that topic before we move on to something else? Going once, going twice. All right, we're down to about just 18 minutes, so I don't think that's enough time to reasonably go around the room as usual, since that sometimes can take 2 hours in and of itself. So I think we should just, if anyone has anything interesting to say, especially if it doesn't open up a can of worms and is pretty much just self-contained. For my part, I'm going to say that I installed Linux briefly on my son's gaming machine we just built. We just built a new machine with a Ryzen 5 5600, a Radeon, I'm going to get that one wrong, 6650, I think. Everything is relatively new, and everything just went fine. Linux Mint installed perfectly without problems. What we wanted to see is, we brought up Steam and wanted to see how many games would play out of the box. I think he has just south of 250 games, and about 100 were ready to go out of the box. The goal was not to make his life more difficult or change things up. He wanted a new machine, which he could play all his games on. So we then immediately installed Windows on it. But it was very promising to see that a large number of the games, especially a lot of the newer games, would just work. So that's my offering. Does anyone else have anything? Linux Mint was the distribution, the latest 21.1 or whatever it is. Arnold. And so, yeah, anyone else got anything for this month?
Along those lines, I bought a Steam Deck around Christmas time as a present for me and the wife. She has a Steam account but doesn't like gaming on a computer too much, and so she prefers the console experience. And it actually runs Arch Linux, and Valve is doing tremendous work in getting Windows games to run on Linux. I'm quite like you. I mean, I play some Steam games on my Linux machine here, but I was expecting her to have some trouble, but it's been she doesn't play like hardcore, game, more casual stuff, and it's been fine. In fact, you can get a KDE. It was like you hit one button, you've got a KDE desktop on that thing. Pretty interesting.
So I don't know if anybody noticed, but back in the days when we had our live get-togethers down in Asheville, this one meeting, this woman came. I think she worked for Ubuntu or whatever, but she gave us all these shirts that have the Ubuntu symbol on it.
I was going to comment on that, Pete. I couldn't see the whole thing, so I didn't want to embarrass myself if it was some sort of fertility symbol or something. But
no, it's Ubuntu. Also, nothing to do with Linux, but last week I had a group of Summit on the Air amateur radio operators up on my mountain, which is private. I had to guide them up to the top, and I think they were able to make, I think they said 15 contacts all over the country: California, Florida, Michigan, New York, from 4,300 feet on 40 and 20 meters and 2 meters. Local contacts on 2. That's it.
I just want to do a shout out for our website, our group of websites coming along really well, I think. And we've got our problems with Gmail's MX servers ironed out, Alan and I. So I appreciate all those people who have gone up and created accounts. If you're using a Gmail email address, you won't have any problems now. And so we have a forum on the site now. We also have other things that you might be interested in, articles and such on Linux and open source, which I'll be adding to. But all the preliminary work and design has been completed. It's just now getting it, filling it up with other things like articles and such. We also have a connection to an RSS feed reader, which I'm hosting on a Raspberry Pi 4 from my home. So you can click on the menu and go up to RSS feed, and you can get news around the world, tech news, world news, local news, that kind of stuff. Okay. So it's coming along.
Question for you, Dan.
Yeah.
How do I know I'm on the Drupal site, not just on the Google Mail site, or what's the ins and outs of that?
Well, just go up to the domain, which is WNCLinuxUsersGroup.com. Okay. And if you're going there, then you're hitting our domain website.
Okay.
You're not on the Google group.
Gotcha.
So it should be good to create an account on there, and it should be stable and stuff now.
Yep. Oh, okay. Yeah, we had a little bit of trouble with Linode with our IPv6 address. That was the issue we had. Google didn't like our PTR records or pointer records, which are reverse DNS. They kept saying that we did not have a reverse DNS pointing to our IPv6 address, and I've addressed that, and I think that's ironed out now. So MX Toolbox is reporting that it's in place. Google's reporting it's in place, and I've tested it, and I haven't had any issues.
Yeah, I've fought with Google on the mail side a lot. I do. Yeah.
And DNS. A pain in the ass.
Yeah, it is a bit of a rough time with them. Yeah,
but I really have a shout out to Alan for doing the DKIM and the SPF and the DMARC records and such on the network side, in getting the IPv6 for the MX side too is, the final straw.
I've heard a lot of Linode and DigitalOcean have, sometimes you get lumped in with a lot of bad actors, and so Gmail has a tendency just to block huge net blocks. I run my mail server on a colo down in Durham, but yeah.
Well, see, that's the issue we had, Leander, was we were using a shared IP.
Yeah.
And so if you've got people who've, done bad things in the past, and then you inherit that.
Yep. So, yep, I fought the mail battle for many years. I still do it. So somebody's got to.
Yeah. But we've got we probably have about 11 users right now signed up with accounts registered. And there are things that you can see if you're an authenticated user that you can't see as a non-authenticated. Access to the forum is one of them. Access to RSS is another, I believe. And so I want to keep it that way. And, the forum, unfortunately, is just the basic generic forum. I wish I could do it like something like a PHP BB. And there are modules, I believe, in Drupal that you can incorporate and make it that way, but it's just difficult. So I'm still learning Drupal as well. So as time goes on, those things will improve.
Another thing that just popped in my head, I pretty much completed at work. I've been slowly moving my virtual machines from CentOS 7, which they had been for years and years and years, to Debian 11. And I finally, like right before the holidays, things were slow, and I figured, like, hey, that's something I could work on. And I got the vast majority of those moved over, which allowed me to sort of go through my the various little hacks I've created over the years in Linux. Just sort of a gentle reminder of how much of a Swiss Army knife it can be as far as solving little problems in a enterprise network. All right. Anyone else got anything interesting going on?
Nope.
Brent, do you use IP6 addressing in any of your network applications?
We do not. With the normal asterisk, is some things do natively for local networking or like mobile networks or things that we kind of sort of use. But as far as our network, no. There were some products that kind of semi required it that we were looking into using at once upon a time, but we never really got anywhere with it. There's just in the United States for public addressing, there's enough addresses to not force us into it. We, in fact, with the cloud now, like we have ample IP addresses. Like our need for IP addresses is less than it's ever been. We're consuming less of our assigned IPv4 space than ever. Not to say we're going to tell our provider, hey, you can have it back. We're not going to be that good. But no, yeah, we just it's always been a weird issue. It's like no one really wants to adopt it, and especially when you're talking about internal networks where you have the ability to use network address translation. There's no need. I'm not saying that IPv6 isn't better. It absolutely is. It's got a lot of features that if you were starting from scratch, it's the way to go, but no one's ever starting from scratch.
Well, after diving into IP6, it is extremely complicated, and it's a real kludgy network protocol. And it's just, if I never have to deal with another IP6 network, I'll be very happy.
I think it's a good design. It is a forward-thinking design, but especially in healthcare where you're dealing with, legacy. And when I say legacy, I'm not talking, 5-year-old stuff, 10-year-old stuff. It can be 20-year-old stuff or more. It's just you can't be aggressive. You can't expect everything to work with something new. And IPv6 isn't new, but again, that there's still a lot of stuff that's not built around it even today.
Yeah, where IPv6 shines is encryption too. So it's got the encryption capability of IPv6 is much better than IPv4.
Where you see
I
it.
gotta drop, guys, but thanks. Good presentation, Leander.
Thanks for stopping by.
WNCLUG.
Thanks for stopping by.
Good
And
to meet you, John.
he's actually, I think he said he's got to go out and do a AMSAT demonstration for a school or something earlier. But we actually, in the U.S., this is something we've run into at work, is mobile carriers make extensive use of IPv6. T-Mobile and AT&T, and we've had some issues because they have a 4 to 6 adapt, or 6 to 4, it's a black box essentially on the edge of their network with our VPN, where we have some users who sign in on a mobile network through the VPN, and our VPN is IPv4 obviously, and so there's something's going on in their black box that it's not always happy there, the 6 to 4 conversion. So yeah, but mobile carriers in the US actually make pretty extensive use of V6.
My ISP requires IPv6 spectrum.
Are they they're not doing carrier grade NAT?
They may be, but I know that I have to make sure that IPv6 is that I work with it on my hardware.
Interesting.
All right. Well, I don't want to let the awkward silences go on too long. So unless someone pipes up right away, anyone?
I got
Good,
a question.
Go ahead.
Sure thing.
Has anybody heard or have info on a new service called Dish Wireless, which is going to be providing internet access streaming over cell phone frequencies? No.
Guess
Okay.
not.
Negative.
All right, one last question. Does anybody have any thoughts about the LastPass security breach and whether you feel that it's still trustworthy, or what steps can be taken, should be taken to try to secure your LastPass passwords?
Alan, read my latest article on our Drupal site.
Okay, thank you.
Alan,
Yes.
can you hear me? Yeah,
Yes.
I would routinely not trust it.
I have a problem with any model where you're storing your passwords in the cloud, as such. Storing an encrypted database that only you can unlock in the cloud is fine, as long as you're the one that controls the encryption. If someone else controls the encryption, obviously you don't have control over your passwords, which to me is not good.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I use KeyPass and I have the database. I mean, I have it on my Nextcloud instance, but I'm kind of in control of the whole thing. But Bitwarden seems to be the tool of choice here lately for self-hosting. I may convert to that.
I do hear that again and again, for sure.
There's
That
also
Bitwarden's the way to go.
VaultWarden. There's VaultWarden and Bitwarden. So,
I've just been using KeyPass for a long time, so.
I'll keep my RoboForm.
All right, last call. All righty. Well, given that,